Hello everyone, and now it is time to meet the people. The leader of the settlers, the Irish dispossessed, and the English authorities. And we're finally going to pull back the curtain on a Dutch pirate king with a legacy that reaches all the way to the 21st century Hollywood and New York high society. Prior warning, he has way more information on him that I could find than anyone else. So anyways, here we go. So let's start with the ringleader, the orchestrator. Whatever name you give him, the name he gave himself was Murat Reis, but the name he was born with, in Haarlem, Holland, born around 1570, we have Janzoon. He was, as with a lot of future tyrants, a seemingly normal boy and young adult. On the 9th of January, 1603, he married a woman we met earlier in the series, Sutgen Gav, and had 3 children, Maria in 1603, Lisbeth in 1608, who we'll meet later, and Train in 1610. But then, something turns him from an ordinary working man to escape from Holland and a life as a Barbary pirate. Around 1600, Janzoon began working as a privateer. Essentially, a privateer was a state-sanctioned pirate. By permission, Janzoon was encouraged to harass, attack and loot Spanish ships, since Holland had been at war with Spain for about 80 years at that point. But the line between privateering and piracy is paper thin, and Janzoon took as much advantage of this as he could. He'd attack Spanish ships under the Dutch flag, but then hoist either a black flag or even the Ottoman flag, and attack any ship he saw, regardless of nationality. It is during this time that Sutgen, his wife, Maria, Lisbeth and Train, his children, are completely abandoned. His luck in 1618 runs out, or does it? Off the coast of Lanzarote, he is overtaken by a group we have become intimately acquainted with in this series, Algerian corsairs. He ends up at the wrong end of a fate he will dole out to countless people afterward. He's taken to Algiers as a captive. Janzoon turns Turk. If you haven't listened to the rest of the series, this means he converts to Islam and decides to take on a new name. One of the most famous names in Algiers at this time is Murat Reis, so Janzoon decides to call himself Murat Reis the Younger. He is immediately taken under the wing of a man by the name of Suleiman Reis. However, the crazy thing is, he himself, Suleiman Reis, is a Dutch convert. Suleiman is killed by a cannonball in 1619, and Murat Reis takes the opportunity with both hands. He takes control of the boat and actually moves it to the Moroccan port of Salé. With the distance from Algiers, he can afford to act independently, and this is exactly what he does. He sets up the Republic of Salé in 1619, completely free of Moroccan rule. Unsurprisingly, Murat is elected first president and Grand Admiral. Under the Republic of Salé, essentially, piracy becomes legitimized as a form of business. As I briefly mentioned in one of the previous episodes, he is invited to Holland a few years later, in 1622. At the port of Veer, the Dutch bring his first family, his wife and 3 children, in an attempt to get him back to Dutch life. Instead, Reis just restocks his ships and sails right back. But all stories must come to an end. By 1627, relationships get strained in Salé, and he relocates to Algiers. Spurred on by a new sense of adventure, this is when he starts planning raids such as the Icelandic raid we mentioned, plus, slightly later, the sack of Baltimore itself. But he also, just before the Icelandic raid, takes over an island in the Bristol Channel known as Lundy. Amazingly, he's able to hold this for 5 years. He does other bits and pieces, but aside from his watery escapades, he also uses his language skills to be chief negotiator in the Franco-Moroccan Treaty of 1631. But he who lives by the sword must die by the sword. In 1635, just 5 years after destroying Baltimore, County Cork, Murat Reis the Younger, born Janzoon, is captured off the coast of Tunisia by what was essentially a Catholic coast guard, the Knights of Malta. Kind of ironic, he had sacked a Protestant settlement, only to be captured 4 years later by Catholics. Now, Catholics back then were, or at least some were, more, shall we say, permissive of rough handling of enemies. Murat Reis was thrown into infamous Maltese dungeons and tortured in captivity for 5 years. However, he, in a way, has the last laugh. Corsairs attacked Malta in 1640 and he escaped. Unfortunately for him, the dungeon by this point has taken its toll. He does make it back to Morocco, where he is given a ceremonial governorship, but only just. From December 1640 to August 1641, his daughter Lisbeth, remember her from his Dutch marriage? Anyway, she visits him all the way from Haarlem. Dressed in finery, seated on silk carpets and surrounded by guards, Lisbeth can't help but notice her father is, and I quote, a feeble old man. Sometime shortly after Lisbeth leaves in August, Janzoon, Murat Reis, dies. But this is not the end, so to speak. Once he had converted to Islam and become well known, Reis at some point married a woman known only as Margarita. She is thought to have been a Moorish princess based in Cartagena in modern Spain. They had 2 sons, Abraham and Anthony. Anthony is actually the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Cornelius Vanderbilt. That's something that'll mean a lot more to my American listeners than to others. The Vanderbilts are the premier American dynasty of the Gilded Age, becoming the nation's wealthiest family through pioneering massive expansion of railroad and shipping industries that built the foundation of US corporate power and elite society. And all from Murat Reis. Now, what about the Irish and the English? Firstly, Sir Walter Coppinger. He was widely despised, a ruthless figure in West Cork. As we mentioned in a previous episode, he was a Hiberno-Norse Catholic lawyer and a notoriously aggressive moneylender. He was almost a one-man band version of the worst caricature of a vulture fund you can think of. He finds people with lots of stuff, but not a lot of money. Then he'll offer them a mortgage taken against some asset the person has, then, just whenever he felt like it, would demand the money back and say if they can't pay, they have to give him a certain thing of his choosing. The McCarthys fell foul of this in 1594, and Coppinger found himself Cloughan Castle. Unsurprisingly, the clan fought back legally, but, being a lawyer, when the case closed in 1633, it was Coppinger who came out on the right side. Ballincollig Castle was a case of rinse and repeat. And of course, after becoming sergeant in 1609, he started a relentless harassment of the Baltimore settlement. Coppinger, as a nationalist Catholic, hated everything the Baltimore Puritans stood for. He literally fought them, legally, for decades, culminating in a lease agreement we mentioned multiple times in the series. A lease due to expire on the 20th of June 1631, the very date of the attack and sack of Baltimore. Unsurprisingly, there is a theory that has lasted the 395 years since the attack. Did Coppinger use his contacts to make fully sure that the settlers wouldn't have a chance of extending the lease a day more than they were legally allowed? In the short term, Coppinger gets his way. He had unsuccessfully run for mayor of Cork the year before, but after the raid, Coppinger just essentially walks right into a lease of Baltimore. This is on the condition that Mr. Thomas Bennett, who we met in the last episode, gets a certain plot of land that is the equivalent of the amount a team of 3 cows can plough in a year, and yes, that is a real measurement in the 1630s. But, just like Janzoon, money can't save him from a bleak end. In 1639, Sir Walter Coppinger dies in Cloggan Castle, and, by all accounts, he is destitute and broke, to put it mildly. But hey, what about the man before any of these? The Gaelic chieftain that you may have forgotten about, Fineen O'Driscoll. Sir Fineen O'Driscoll embodies the sad fate of the Gaelic clans. He was the chief of practically all of the Cork region. As we mentioned earlier in the series, Fineen became Sir Fineen in 1587 in an attempt to not lose his head, which worked. And remember the Black Rent? If you forgot, Sir Fineen charged foreign fleets massive taxes for the pleasure of fishing O'Driscoll waters. In 1601, he flipped and, as you might remember, this, along with his decision to work with the Spanish who came to help the Catholics, nearly killed him. His children's fates are fascinating. He had a son who became Lord of Castlehaven, and his daughter married Sir Walter Coppinger's brother Richard. Crazy stuff. To be fair, it's often seen as a case of keeping your enemies close. Also, remember, years before that, his other daughter Moira had been taken by Ali Crusa, a Corsair pirate. Fineen O'Driscoll spends his final years in a tiring legal battle with his son-in-law's brother, Walter Coppinger. Funnily enough, Coppinger's luck runs out in 1629, when the elderly Fineen is ruled in favour of, and gets £13,000 in compensation for Coppinger's tactics. For reference, this in today's money is £2.5 to £3.5 million. Exhausted, he travels to England, where he dies shortly after. And now to the founder of the colony, Englishman Sir Thomas Crooke. Born a staunch Calvinist in Northamptonshire in 1574, with highly intellectual brothers and close connections to prominent Puritan families, Thomas started studying law in 1597. Around 1600, he looked west and saw opportunity. He partnered with Fineen O'Driscoll to buy out Baltimore and set up the booming pilchard fishery that it became. In 1607, he cut Fineen out completely. Now, we've mentioned in other episodes his court appearance in charges of helping pirates, so it's kind of ironic what happened in 1631. Anyways, after signing the lease in 1610, he sat as MP for Baltimore in 1615 and 1616, building it into a rotten borough but political stronghold. Now, this episode is already dense enough, but unsurprisingly, he was embroiled in court cases all the way up to 1628, when he was called to the Irish bar. I mean as a lawyer, not a pub, but only lasted 2 years, before dying in 1630, only a year after Fineen, and then, just a year before the sacking of Baltimore, the founders and protectors of Baltimore are gone. I said in the last episode I found one man in particular fascinating, and that man is William Harris, the undisputed hero of Baltimore. Living in the upper town of Baltimore, he was woken by the noise, and the rest of his actions are detailed in a previous episode. But suffice to say that, firstly, he is personally responsible for the list of captives stretching no further than 107, albeit, that is still a lot. And also, a whole lot more needs to be known about this man. The 4 captives of importance are Ellen Hawkins and Joan Broadbrook, and Old Osborne and his maid Alice Hurd. Ellen and Joan are, if you remember, the only people to have made it back alive. However, they couldn't face the sight of their trauma, so stayed instead in England for the rest of their lives. For Osborne and Hurd, their fate was different. Now, this is one of the things that really annoys me about history. Aside from the fact they were abandoned on the shore, we have no idea why. It's all just guesswork. The only extra detail of any of the 4 that we have is that Ellen Hawkins cost £86 and Joan Broadbrook cost £150, respectively. We need to know more. But if you'll allow me, I'll finish by reading the names of all the captives known to us, followed in a separate episode by Thomas Davis's poem, The Sack of Baltimore. The combined list of captives. Mr. William Mould and his boy, Alexander Pumery and his wife, John Ryder, his wife and 2 children, Robert Hunt and his wife, Abram Roberts, his wife and his 3 children, Corinth Cruffin, his wife, his daughter, and 3 men, John Harris, his wife, his mother, 3 children, and his maid, Dermot Mergy, his 2 children, and his maid, Richard Meade, his wife, his sister, and 4 children, Stephen Broadbrook, his wife, likely Joan, and 2 children, Old Honkin, his wife, and his daughter, a man called Evans, and his boy, a cook, his wife, and his maid, Bessie Flood and her son, Stephen Pierce, his wife, his mother, and his 3 children, William Simons, his wife, and 2 children, Christopher Norway, his wife, and his child, Samson Rogers and his son, Bessie Peters and her daughter, Thomas Payne, his wife, and 2 children, Richard Watts, his wife, and 2 children, William Gunter, his wife, his maid, and 7 sons, John Amble, Edward Cherry, Robert Chimer, his wife, and his 4 children, Timothy Curlew's wife, and Timothy Curlew himself was killed, John Slyman, his wife, and his 2 children, Morris Power, and his wife. Joan Broadbrook was confirmed as some connection to Stephen Broadbrook. She was ransomed in 1646 for $150 after 15 years of slavery. Ellen Hawkins, believed to be one of the 5 women listed as maid on the original list, was ransomed in 1646 for $86. Moira O'Driscoll was the daughter of Sir Fineen O'Driscoll and is mentioned in some traditions as having been captured by a pirate named Ali Crusa and sold into the slave trade. The pirates released 5 people just before leaving Baltimore harbour. Old Osborne, an elderly resident, set back ashore. Alice Hurd, his maid. John Hackett, the Dungarvan fisherman who piloted the pirates. He was released but later hanged for conspiracy. Thomas Carew, a pilot from Dungarvan also, set ashore with Hackett. Edward Follett, a captain from a Dartmouth ship who acted as a guide during Reconnaissance and was released. Timothy Curlew was killed during the initial assault at the Cove, and John Davis was hacked to death in the fray while resisting capture. Of the 107 taken, this list identifies 42 by name or family group. That leaves 65 souls, the majority, known only as numbers in the historical record. Beyond the villagers, the pirates seized 47 others from ships captured on their way to Baltimore, bringing the total number of prisoners to 154. 9 Portingales, who were Portuguese, 3 Palicians, 17 Frenchmen, 9 Englishmen, most from Dartmouth, and 9 men from 2 fishing boats out of Dungarvan. In the next episode, I will just read the poem, as it is quite long. And at that note, thank you for listening. Like this if you can, tell me what you did and didn't like, and follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster, and, most importantly, tell everyone about the History and Heritage podcast. Bye.